It will be a notice of intent to refer the debt to Treasury. So if those kind of go into the trash and nobody addresses them at that time,
Well, they're going into the trash because the assumption is that
the case settled, right?
the case settled or that's being taken care of by someone else.
Alexander Hamilton once said, "I will use the Department of Treasury to address Medicare lien repayment lethargy." Okay, Hamilton didn't actually say that, not even on Broadway, but it's nevertheless true. Today on Medivest, the podcast, Natt and I talk about when Treasury comes knocking post-settlement.
So I want to throw a scenario at you.
Alrighty.
I have settled a work comp claim. I'm the injured party. I've settled, done, moving on with my life, got to my mailbox, open it up, and get a letter from Treasury that says I owe them money associated with my settlement. Heard about that happening several times. We've been involved in some situations where that's happened, related to conditional payments unpaid. How does that happen?
How does it happen? Well, usually in a workers' compensation case, the employer will pay the conditional payments that are for the accepted injury from the date of settlement, from the date of injury until the date of settlement, right? The employer is responsible for the medicals of their employee for anything that happens that was part of their workers' compensation claim, right? But there could be a few different scenarios where there would be an outstanding amount being argued to be owed by the Department of Treasury. So first of all, the Department of Treasury is a separate agency from CMS. So what happens is, if it came from a workers' compensation settlement, what likely happened was the conditional payment claim, right, progressed beyond a general conditional payment letter or notice, and then moved into a demand phase. So it should have been sent to that Medicare beneficiary, right? The question is, did the attorney for the Medicare beneficiary also get a copy of those conditional payment letters? So that's what a little short jumping off point, but the representative for the claimant applicant, we'll just say for the workers' compensation case, while they are not directly responsible for the payment of conditional payments from the date of injury up until the date of settlement, they, as a general matter of practice, they should have a consent to release signed by their client, and then attach themselves, be authorized to view the conditional payment correspondence and that process that is essentially being handled by the carrier or the employer side throughout the process. So, the conditional payment process for workers' compensation is very similar to the conditional payment process for liability cases, but the difference is essentially who's responsible for the payment during the pendency of the claim up until the date of settlement. So, right, just to break that down, is that in a liability case, the attorney representing the injured party should either on their own, right, through their law firm, gain access through the MSPRP, the portal, the Medicare Secondary Payer Recovery Portal, to view any and all conditional payment claims arising from the representation of that individual that's injured, or hire a third party to do that, right? So in many respects, from any kind of injury-related conditional payment letter from Medicare from the date of injury to the date of settlement is commonly referred to as liens or a Medicare lien, right? Like technically, Medicare doesn't have to do anything they don't have to file anything in a courthouse, so to speak, to perfect a lien. It's considered a super lien, essentially, but they get the opportunity, because they have to, under the federal law, chase the payments that they make, that we talked about in the past. So when they're doing that process, somebody needs to keep an eye on it and make sure, like, what are they chasing? What are they recovering? Are they recovering for somebody's services related to their hypertension and diabetes when they had a knee injury or a lower back injury? That would be inappropriate, because it's, so it's often found that the requests by Medicare in their conditional payment correspondence is actually overbroad, and they'll have codes, ICD codes, for conditions that are not related to the compensated injury. So those should be disputed. So on a liability case, those should be disputed by, on behalf of the injured plaintiff. And in a workers' compensation case, which is your example, would be typically disputed by the employer or the workers' comp carrier, right? So now there's a little wrinkle in that some people, they come to the claim with pre-existing conditions. So let's say in a workers' compensation case, they might have injured their upper extremity and their shoulder. So they have it like an right arm injury and shoulder injury, and it also affected their neck. But they also had a pre-existing condition in the lumbar spine, the lumbar or lower back area. So when they present their claim, and the attorney's presenting it, sometimes, in the liability area, and I think in workers' comp, probably there's a reputation that, sometimes plaintiffs or the claimant applicant's attorneys might throw it in, everything in, including the kitchen sink, right? But, usually they're trying to specifically get their client compensated for the injuries they sustain. But there are times when it gets a little confusing as to whether maybe, for example, you might have a situation where somebody has an exacerbation of a pre-existing condition, but then it goes away, right? So it gets inflamed. It was already a condition they've had maybe once, twice, 3 times in the past, and then it could have been affected initially, but then it's determined through, let's say, the IME process, or over time it's fleshed out that it really, it resolved and it really wasn't part of the claim. So those are the wrinkles of these cases, is that carriers can sometimes, they'll accept to pay for certain parts of the claim, but they will deny other parts of the claim. And so, but the problem is that if it was claimed initially and then ultimately gets released, as CMS likes to use the terms claimed and or released, that there's a good chance that at some point, if there are any bills that Medicare pays, right, for dates of service, for example, that arose from the date of injury to the date of settlement that weren't part of any previously covered and negotiated, right? It could have been disputed, it could have been resolved, but if it wasn't resolved, or they were not part of a prior conditional payment claim, there's a chance that after the settlement, those dates of service that are still prior to the date of settlement could arise as a conditional payment debt. So they could go. So what happens is, if the attorney was not monitoring the case and their client receives those conditional payment letters, because they'll be copied on those letters along with the letters that go to the carriers. So in the workers' comp realm, the letters come from the CRC, the subcontractor for CMS, going after and recovering from the commercial entity. But once that case settles, the BCRC, the Benefits Coordination and Recovery Center, is the one that will send letters directly to the claimant in that case. And those letters sometimes find their way into the trash bin, right? So the attorney doesn't even know about them when they're in the conditional payment stage. After they might even have a conditional payment notice that's typically done 30 days before a demand. And then lo and behold, a demand comes out and it requests or demands payment within 60 days. If it's not paid within 60 days, interest begins accruing. And then another 60 days from the date of the demand, an additional letter will come out from that BCRC, and it will be a notice of intent to refer the debt to Treasury. So if those kind of go into the trash and nobody addresses them at that time,
Well, they're going into the trash because the assumption is that
the case settled, right?
the case settled or that's being taken care of by someone else.
Right, that's true. Yeah, the claimants are. I mean, nobody is teaching them about the intricacies of the collections system under the MSP. Excuse me. So they see the letters. They've probably seen a few letters from CMS along the way. If they're a Medicare beneficiary right now, they're probably getting some, general letters that are things like an explanation of benefits and things like that. Mm-hmm. These letters that are sent by CMS for recovery of MSP debt don't look that much different than other letters that are coming from CMS for other medical services. So it's kind of, when they see a conditional payment letter the first time and it says this is not a bill, they may not be paying attention to it. Even when it says conditional payment notice, it's still not a bill. Then it's a demand, but it doesn't say this is a bill. and it doesn't even say demand in a big letters or bolded. It's just in the reference section, demand. And so they're like, it looks like the same thing the last time that I got, and I don't know what this is. I already settled the case. I've received my money, and then they don't think anything of it. When the Department of Treasury letter comes, that's sometimes when we see these cases, like we might be administering a Medicare set-aside for an injured applicant or claimant. And, as a member for Medivest, we evaluate whether or not any kind of bills or statements are related to their injury and is Medicare covered, but it's only for dates of service after the settlement.
Right.
And so it's a frustrating time for many parties in that case where the BCRC has sent a letter asking for payment for a claim that everyone thought was settled, and without knowing whether or not there was an issue associated whether it was an accepted or non-accepted injury. If it was an accepted injury, it should have been the responsibility of the employer. But once that compromise and release or settlement is signed and approved from on the comp side, it's very difficult for for somebody to handle that. So typically you have to get the settlement documents. You want to submit the settlement documents to CMS. You want to explain what happened, what was the accepted injuries, what was the what were the injuries that were being compensated, and then to kind of dive into that. But it's really not part of the administration process per se.
Right.
And it's like that's really considered essentially lien resolution. So it's like a separate service for an injured party, just like it would be on the liability side. And but it is an interesting thing that the Treasury letters don't have the same case ID numbers as the CMS letters do, and they can be very confusing. So if it's a
correlating it is hard sometimes.
It can be very hard. And on the carrier side, workers' comp side, they get letters from the Treasury too, that emanated initially from the CRC, the Commercial Repayment Center, and sometimes large $1 billion insurance carrier will be receiving letters, but they maybe don't get the letters until there's already secondary action taking place. So like in the remedies available to the Department of Treasury are typically they can be kind of onerous. They twofold. One, for injured individuals, they can go to a private collection action. But most commonly what we see is this Treasury offset program. And that can happen on the commercial side as well, where they just pull money. So like, they can pull money from like what would have been a tax refund, right? Or they could pull money on the claimant applicant side from their general Social Security funding, or their Social Security disability insurance money, or SSI. So it can be pretty sad when it's essentially like a garnishment where they get involved. So that's how it can happen.
So if we're talking about receiving a request for payment from Treasury for expenses that are reasonably considered to be something that should have been reimbursed by the payer prior to settlement because it was a responsibility of the payer prior to settlement, how does someone go about getting the payer to pay for that, or getting that party to take care of it for you instead of you having to use it from, like you said, a garnishment or your settlement funds, or as some people think, their MSA, which is not accurate? What's the process for that?
Well, it can vary, but I mean, essentially, is
it easy? Is it hard? Like
it can be. It could be easy and it could be hard, and unfortunately,
that's great.
The reason is because here's where the rub is. By law, the employers have to pay for these medicals that arose prior to the date of settlement, but the settlement documents, right, the actual settlement, the contract that is entered into between the injured party and the payer, governs exactly what happens with, like, what the money is for and who's being indemnified and released.
Got it.
Right? So what happens is if the claimant applicant's attorney, I'm just using those two terms together, but if they negotiated in detail to specify that if there are payments made by Medicare for dates of service that were related to the injury that were not submitted to Medicare, for example, prior to the date of settlement, but they're submitted after the date of settlement, or if they had not been addressed at the time of settlement, but they were related to the injury and are covered by Medicare. If the settlement document specifies that the carrier would be responsible for that, then that could be, the settlement language could be used and provided back to the carrier to say, please pay in accordance with the settlement agreement. If there's other language in that settlement agreement that says that by paying the dollars that they are being released and they are not responsible for any payments, whether they arose, prior to or after the date of settlement, then it's a lot harder. It's not an easy situation. So I think that just gives you an idea of why advocacy is important, right? Each side should be represented, and by competent parties to help smooth out that process. I've definitely seen scenarios where it's not that hole, let's just say, is not filled properly in the settlement document, and it just causes confusion. And it could end up being a situation where now you have a fight over this one area that should have been something that should have been taken care of. If all the details have been addressed and the settlement documents have been kind of buttoned up.
Clear their debt, clear your desk.
Take back your valuable time with Clear Liens, Medivest's lien resolution service. Call us today at 877-725-2467 or visit us at medivest.com.
These type of expenses isn't this typically something that you would expect to be caught via like a normal lien investigation process?
Ideally, it would be, but it's not just it's computer systems. It's also just the timing. Quite honestly, the timing of submission of bills. Providers have up to 1 year
Right.
to bill Medicare for services rendered. So if you have knowing who knowing your party, if you're representing an injured party, knowing what's happened, you're building up and getting ready for, let's say, case management conferences. Sometimes you're doing discovery, and you're focusing on that aspect of your case. But are you also checking in and verifying exactly what the treatment pattern has been from within this last year? Like it's important. Like some of these cases have been going on for years, and maybe there was an issue with a Medicare set aside that was submitted to CMS years ago, and there was a large counter hire, or you just never know what's happening in a case until you. Well, the point is, an attorney should be watching exactly what's going on with the case and knowing all the medical bills and all the treatment that their client is receiving all the way up until the date of settlement, and then addressing all of that issue so that there's not like this unknown factor. If the carrier knows that this person's been treating, and then they just have some standard language that the payment covers all treatments, regardless of whether it was before or after the date of settlement, that could put basically it's going to mean that the plaintiff or the claimant applicant will end up having to pay, use their settlement money for some of their pre-settlement services. So, I think that parties should do better or do their best to avoid that problem.
I'm going to make a probably dumb assumption here. That the assumption being
You mean like an assuming
yes
assumption?
I'm
Okay.
definitely be doing some of that here.
Okay.
The assuming that I'm doing being that if you have Section 111 in place and sufficient reporting is being done timely to Medicare of that claim and the details thereof, and this individual has been perhaps treating for a while under this open claim, and you have had conditional payments in the past that you're resolving, and in the presence of the knowledge of the existence of this claim and the fact that CMS is aware of it, as the claim progresses towards settlement, those should taper off, and that a proper coordination should be occurring, i.e. work comp is paying and Medicare is not paying, and one would think that would begin to taper off. And even if you do have a period of time where, say 12 months, like you said, where a provider is submitting and perhaps there's still consistent, frequent treatment of the injury such that claims could be stacking up and being submitted on a schedule or with some frequency, maybe have it delayed. Although I don't know to extent, I have no familiarity with this, how deep into that 12 months those provider claims are being submitted. I mean, we get them pretty quick for stuff that we're administering.
Yeah. Well,
pretty darn quick. But
yeah.
You would think that the likelihood that you would be hit with a fairly high one post-settlement that other parties were not aware of or had not addressed would be fairly low. But from what we've seen and from what I've heard in others, that isn't always necessarily the case.
Right. And I think that there could be other reasons why somebody would receive a Treasury letter, because that's right. Where I think that probably more often, instead of the delay from the provider to Medicare, more often those kind of sticky issues could arise from like the issue about whether it's an accepted injury or a denied injury, right? So there's the idea here is that like the carrier is going to know what they fought over with the CRC. Does the claimant know what was fought over, or was it happening like with them on copy, but there's a fight, maybe an appeal that happened over some of these issues of the pre-existing conditions, whether there was an exacerbation or was it fully resolved, was it accepted versus denied. So at the end of the day, it's like, are we moving through the motions as the attorney, let's say an attorney representing the claimant, and just saying, hey, this is the best we could do, and without knowing the details of those conditional payments? Or did they say, hey, we need to know what's going on, so like we're going to have our authorization submitted so that we can get copies along with the claimant, and then we can monitor what the appeals, if there's any appeals for conditional payments, disputes, what was the dispute process like when the demand came out? Was there an appeal, and is there anything lingering? Because to get an idea, like if all those fights, if those fights over these were a couple $1,000s, that may or may not make a big difference, right? But it still is a difference. So from an attorney's perspective, you always want to provide your client informed consent, right? So when they're settling a case, that they understand, hey, we're settling for this. There were some disputes over these pre-existing conditions because, like, you know about it, we know about it, and they know about it. So there was this range of settlement value. We've tried to get our highest settlement value based on that. There is a question over a certain portion of this, right? This would be nice for an injured party to understand when right before they sign, as opposed to like, hey, everything's good, it's all handled, you sign this, and we'll hopefully never see each other again, right? That's not a great way of doing it, because it is interesting from a perspective of a professional administrator that we sometimes have scenarios where we feel like the attorney that represented them didn't necessarily give them the full informed consent that they should have had.
Sure.
So,
and that sometimes
that can be frustrating.
That sometimes appears to be because the attorney may not have themselves completely understood the dynamic. And we're going to talk about this in another episode. The reality of folks who have settled a claim, those particularly we work with professional administration, the extent to which they really are fairly uninformed about what has just happened.
Yeah. Well, the MSP, was really didn't come into play until the 1980, right? But it's evolved over time too, with its additional provisions, the different additional acts along the way, and as a result, like an attorney coming out of law school today probably will have a better understanding of the inner workings of the MSP if they get into a field like workers' compensation or liability than somebody that that graduated from law school in the 80s when it was like at its infancy. And so there was a time when maybe it was a flip through the Rolodex, make a phone call, is there a lien or not?
Right.
And before I know that you would find it kind of funny, but before the internet, and
I remember before the internet.
Yeah, right. So, but today, using an agent that has intimate familiarity with this MSPRP, the recovery portal, go right into the system, and being able to gain access with a proof of representation document, making sure attorneys are either themselves attached to those files or has an agent that can do that, that can kind of keep them up to date, is really, I would say it's invaluable, because we talked a little bit about Section 111 reporting.
Yeah.
What we didn't talk about is when there are multiple payers on an account or on a file. So TPOCs, those total payment, the settlements, the total payment obligation of claimant, those dollar amounts, when those are paid, the responsible reporting entity for that payer is reporting that information to Medicare. It's at that moment that Medicare is doing its final sweep, right, for conditional payments. Mm-hmm. If you have a case that settles early with one payer, but then settles, whether it's 6 months down the road or 1 year or 2 years or 4 years down the road, with a second, right, payer. Mm-hmm. And that could be, like in the liability scenario, an at-fault party, but then they had like a lower dollar amount for their liability insurance. So your client also had UM coverage, also known as UIM coverage, so this underinsured and uninsured. So if they had, you settled a case for $100,000, but it was worth $1 million, and they had UIM that covers an additional up to $500,000, for example. If that second case with the UIM doesn't settle for a while, mm-hmm. when that case settles and that gets reported, there's going to be a second sweep for conditional payments.
Right.
Well, has your client continued to treat? Did you think that you took care of the Medicare lien because you had your one case for your client and you took care of that small Medicare lien at the beginning? Well, lo and behold, there could be an additional conditional payment process, because for each payment made, that's a separate, essentially, lien opportunity for Medicare, or mm-hmm. opportunity for Medicare to recover its conditional payments under the MSP. And, this can happen. It could happen in a case where it was a workers' comp case that also had a liability component, right?
Right.
And so it's like, the lien was already handled by the employer for the workers' comp case. Well, what about for the liability case? And when and the timing of that settlement, that's very important. And those factors can also come into play when you're estimating people's future medicals in the Medicare set-aside realm. You have different dollar amounts potentially, at play for the estimated futures. Mm-hmm. And so, you want to rely on somebody that's been through that process, that understands that the distinction and the complexities when you have both a workers' compensation claim and a liability case at the same time. But that's not a Treasury matter.
Well, yeah, but it just goes to show you there's a lot to consider with regard to these things.
Yeah.
And can learn the hard way. That may be the only way to learn it sometimes with things like this. But okay, so main takeaways. Add to them if I miss any. First and foremost is if you're representing an injured party, continue to maintain awareness about the status of conditional payments, what they are they being handled, from whence do they come, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
If you're an injured party, and if you're listening to this, you're probably, it's unlikely that you are, but don't throw anything in the trash, right? And don't assume that someone else is taking care of it.
If you're not sure what it is, it's better to ask.
Yeah.
And if it's a workers' comp case and you're working with an adjuster, you want to ask them too. It's like, somebody's helping you with a case, but when you have an attorney that's handling the case for you, you want to provide them all the information so that they can let them say that you don't have to worry about it.
Right.
And then you can later tell them, what you need from them.
Got
But
it.
yeah, you don't want to. Nobody wants surprises, and quite honestly, the attorneys representing the injured parties, they don't want surprises, and most of the time, I would say this. I mean, I'm sure there's different viewpoints on this, but typically, carriers, when they're handling a workers' comp claim, it's like for those matters that are related to the compensated injury, the carriers want to take care of what they're responsible for at that time too.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
They're going to argue if it's and negotiate and deny if it's something that they feel that they can deny, but nobody wants a surprise after the fact.
Right.
You see, so it's like it's like handling things and not ignoring things is very important.
All right. Well, that's a great place to wrap this up. Thank you.
Excellent. You're welcome. Thank you.
See you on more.
All right.